Nearly 150 men digging trenches and building dams.
Time after time they tried, only to find that courage was not enough.
A light coming out of the water. That was one of the most sort of reassuring and wonderful sights.
Toward the end of the 60s and throughout the 70s, ever more difficult and extreme cave systems were being explored, and new caving techniques were creating many new challenges for the cave rescue teams. Cave diving was also playing an ever-increasing role in new exploration. In the Mendibs, divers like Mike Wooding and Dave Savage were making impressive advances. In Swildens, they'd reached sump 12, while in Wookey Hole, they'd pushed on to attain chamber 18. The technique needed to bring an injured caver through a sump had been filmed by Mendip Rescue Organisation members in Swildens Sump 1 as early as 1960.
And the subject is being taken through now. In the meantime, the lifeline is being gently pulled from the near side, and the air tube is also drawn back so that there are no coils left lying about inside the sump.
After the trauma of Mossdale, Cave Rescue Organisation member Jack Pickup had undergone an underwater rescue demonstration from Oliver Lloyd. Jack would be called upon to use those skills sooner than he had expected.
I got a call to the phone, and it was the police at Settle, and said, look, we've had Reg on, and it's absolutely essential that you need to get yourself together and come over to Muirgill.
While a team from Sheffield University had been descending Muirgill, the frozen moorland had melted, making the mere, the lake in the entrance shaft, rise to form a sump. One member deep in the cave had taken a fall and sustained minor injuries. With help, he had managed to climb several increasingly wet ladder pitches, but he was now trapped behind the entrance sump, and he was showing signs of succumbing to the cold.
So I took one end of the diving rope through to the patient and found him in the streamway, awaiting our arrival. Of course, he was extremely cold. The rest of the cave rescuers then that were there, that were with him, disappeared, and we, John and I, were then left with this guy to get him out. It was only a relatively short dive, but nonetheless, the biggest problem we had was that it was snow melt water, so it was absolutely freezing. The doctor examined him and he was still alive, but unfortunately, hypothermia was really at the far end of him, and he died on the way over the felt.
Events like the Mossdale and Sunset Pot rescues had taken a toll on the aging rescue controllers.
CRO became operational in February 1935, and Reg was involved right from the start. And very soon after that, he was elected Chief Controller, a position that he held until he retired, and I took over from him in 1972.
Changes were now needed, a new approach to meet new demands. In 1974, a public relations exercise at Yaldus Cave, Kingsdale, was organised. Representatives from police, fire brigade, ambulance crews, local farmers and public figures were invited to a demonstration of cave rescue capabilities. Although organised by the Cave Rescue Organisation, Upper Wolfdale team members were also present. Some of the older rescue team members were now taking a back seat. Underground, there was a chance to show some of the latest innovations. The CRO had a new underground doctor, Dr. John Frankland, and a new approach to hypothermia. A wetsuit cocoon developed by the Upper Wolfdale team might well have saved the casualty in Muirgill, were it then available. It had long been known that quickly warming a hypothermic patient from the outside could kill them. A new approach was to supply them with warmed oxygen, which they could then breathe, and which applied heat more directly to the vital inner organs. Chemicals could be mixed together to create a setting foam and quickly provide a lightweight and effective splint. While a promising device known as an inductophone was under development, which used electromagnetic waves and could provide a wireless communication from underground to the surface above. One of the most remarkable rescues involved 16-year-old John Stevens in Derbyshire at Cosworth Cavern on July 7th, 1965. A group of young soldier cadets were sent into the upper entrance to make an unsupervised through trip to where the stream emerges. They were clothed in just army denims, sweater and boots. They had no helmets and carried only candles for lighting.
A number of them had got to the bottom of the rift and they couldn't find the way on, and they assumed for some reason that the flooded passage was the way on. And this guy took a breath and dived in. Fortunately for him, he was the regimental champion swimmer.
Underwater, of course, he was completely without light. When the others emerged, they reported him missing.
DCRO were called, and Ken Pearce dived into the sump, but he wasn't able to make very much progress because there was a constriction not far and he couldn't get past it with his diving kit on.
The only place he thought he could be was in the siphon. His candle was at the entrance to the siphon. I dived in the siphon, very little visibility, couldn't see much at all. I searched each side and the middle. I went right to the end, and at the end it opened out into like a keyhole shape on its side, a bell. I searched all round the bell and I couldn't find anything at all. There was, however, one little hole which I just could not fit in, and I felt up this and I could feel air, and that was the only possible place he could be. So I came out and said we shall have to drain it.
Flight pumps provided a submersible electric pump, and fortunately, because one end of the sump is quite not far underground, and it was pumped out. And after a while, the sort of person who was standing there watching the sump dropping, so they could hear him whistling.
He was located in an airspace just beyond Pearce's far point. He had free dived 90 feet in total darkness and miraculously found the only small alcove above water, where he remained cold for over 12 hours.
How he'd hit this is a 1,000,000 to 1 chance. He'd swum underwater in the darkness with his hat at the regulation handle and his army boots and spats, and hit one little 10-inch wide hole which he'd squeezed up.
He emerged unscathed and almost cocky, and seemingly unaware how lucky he had been to survive. In all regions, inexperience and foolishness have always been the main cause of rescues, and they are usually in the most popular caves.
He had got stuck, and in such a position he was unable to help himself at all, and it was extremely difficult for even our thinnest rescuers to get to him. They were able to get either side of him because there was an alternative way which they could get to him from the rear and from in front, but they were unable to offer him assistance at all in the first instance, and from literally 2 o'clock this afternoon until nearly 9 o'clock this evening, we were unable to move him at all.
Well, he was a fairly big bloke. He was unused to caving, I think, and when he got into the hole he must have panicked slightly and moved further to the left-hand side, and once he was wedged it was very difficult for him to come back up the cave, which was the only reasonable way he could get out, and so he got more and more stuck as he wriggled.
And to get himself in the position which he did was clearly the mark of someone with inexperience.
Because it was the first time he'd ever been down a pothole, wasn't it?
It was indeed, and the last.
The South Wales Cave Rescue was formed by the South Wales Caving Club shortly after it started in 1946. It was situated close to the major caves in the upper Swansea Valley. It seemed ideally situated. But when new discoveries began to emerge in the northern outcrop of the Brecon Beacons, all that began to change. The Gwent Rescue Team was formed by clubs active in the Llangollen area. It was a major incident in Agon Alwyd that would finally force the teams to unite under the umbrella organisation of the South Wales Cave Rescue Organisation. The thirst for new discovery that lured young cave diver Roger Solari to his tragic end. He was with the much more experienced Martin Farr.
Eventually, I was down at about 3 feet depth. I knew I was just under the water's surface. But could I find any air? There was just no air anywhere. As I turned round to make my way back out, the unthinkable occurred, and there was Roger above me on the roof of the passage at 3 feet depth. And I swam up to him, and he didn't have to. Well, we communicated again quite clearly underwater. I said to him quite clearly, we've got to go. We've got to get out of here now. I sped off down the line in front of him. So we were both desperately low on air. But the instant I actually broke surface as well, absolutely incredible relief, obviously, that I'd made it back to an air surface. When eventually I realised there was no sign of Roger, the only thing I could do then was just to sit down and wait.
The difficult recovery operation would need the cooperation of several groups, both cave divers and cave rescuers, and later would result in a formalised amalgamation the following year. More recently, the group expanded its boundaries even further, becoming the South and Mid Wales Cave Rescue Team. Also in 1974, after an incident involving children lost down a mine in Northumberland, the police asked the Cave Rescue Council to organise countrywide cave rescue coverage.
We were asked by ACPO, the Association of Chief Police Officers, if BCRC couldn't manage to set up a kind of a national system so that every police force would know which cave rescue team they could call into their area.
Nationwide, more complex technical rescues were demanding ever-increasing cooperation between the teams.
A young man and his girlfriend had gone into the cave, right to the back end of the cave and up into a boulder choke, climbed up into this boulder choke, and he put himself into a crawl. For some reason best known to him, he decided to slide in on his back. He hadn't got a body's length in to this flat-out crawl at the top of this boulder choke, and the roof fell on him. I mean, eventually the lads that were in there done a tremendous job, and they propped everything up with either with fire service jacks, car jacks, you name it, lumps of wood and a lot, and props, acros. They jacked everything up so that when I eventually went in, along with another chap called Bob Emmett, and between the pair of us, when we got there, eventually, there was a certain amount of shaking heads, and I thought, this must be pretty serious. So we climbed up through this mess. We got up into the top of the crawl, and this guy's feet were stuck out in front of us. And so we could see from looking at it that yes, we were right. It was just slabs, big slabs of limestone, like paving flags almost, but limestone. And so we sort of set to, shouted for a crowbar and a lump hammer and so on and so forth, and managed to split them into slabs that we could manage. So we bashed them and crowbarred them and split them into slabs and actually dragged them off him. So eventually, when the last slab came off, which was barely one I could handle, was that big, we dropped it down to the lads below, down through the boulder choke. I mean, this guy came out of there, you'd thought he'd had a rocket up his arse. He came out of there that quick. And down the crawl, when we got to the bottom, there was this huge cheer went up. You thought we'd just scored a goal.
In the early days, the relationship with the local police was very, very good. But bear in mind, we had a local bobby. I mean, my days go back to Constable Casey, Jerry Bryce, the local constable in this area. They were brilliant. They'd turn up, they'd help you, whatever you needed. They could be, if it was a case of raising some equipment from somewhere, they could deal with that. But yes, they were good. And the ambulance people were quite reasonable, because we would often tell them, they'd say, do you want the ambulance now? No, don't bring it now. We don't need it for 3 hours. It's going to take 3 hours to get this guy out the cave. Don't bring it. We'll phone you, we'll contact you when we need it. And that saved an awful lot of effort. It saved ambulances hanging around at the cave entrance for hours on end with nothing to do. They couldn't do anything until the casualty was out, so why turn up?
Rescue organisations have always had a close but ever-changing relationship with public services like the police, ambulance and particularly the fire service. Joint training exercises were to prove beneficial to both sides.
On arrival, the MRO wardens briefed the fire officer on the situation and the help required.
Same with the fire brigade. The fire brigade were good because occasionally we needed pumping. We needed pumping, the streams pumped. I mean, the classic example was the one with Derek Ford in it, where Derek got trapped in Swilden. At the same time as that was happening, there was a simultaneous rescue in St Cuthbert's where the fire brigade were called out to get a party out. That particular day, there was a monumental flood.
In the mid-60s, Langstroth Cave in the Yorkshire Dales was providing exciting and challenging new discoveries. A second entrance made the short sumps more accessible, and climbing techniques with improvised scaling poles made it possible to follow the stream up a series of verticals. When the upper end was open to the surface, a classic sporting through trip was on offer, abseiling down the drops and emerging by freediving the two short sumps. However, for a team of 6 from Newcastle University, things were to go badly wrong.
The first guy dived through into the air bell, and whatever good air remained in there, he used up. He realised that there was something bad, because when he surfaced, he was like a beach whale. He was gasping. The day before the incident, they'd gone into recce the dive through that they were going to do the next day in the reverse direction. And one can imagine that having dived through to okay it, they'd used up what good air there was in the small air bell. The second diver came to the air bell, tried to grab some air. Of course, there was none there. So he collapsed very quickly, probably due to a combination of lack of oxygen and CO2. The third guy came, exactly the same, surface, no oxygen. Fourth guy came, same as happened, he collapsed into the sump. So there were 3 cavers underwater, effectively dead. And the 5th guy came and dived through, realised there was something, could see something in front of him, and tried to turn round to go back, by which time he was in some sort of trouble. The last caver realised this, dived in and grabbed him and pulled him back and revived him. In fact, what we got then was 1 guy that came out to raise the alarm, 3 cavers dead in the sump, and 2 at the other side which had survived.
Fortunately, anticipating the potential difficulty of a rescue via Langstroth Pod, the Cave Rescue Organisation and the Upper Wharfdale teams, with the cooperation of the fire service, had previously organised a huge joint training exercise to pump the Langstroth Cave sumps using a new and then untested pumping system.
And the setup was such that we had a fire pump at the entrance. We were able to draw water from the cave, push it down fire hoses to the sump, into the ejector pump, and the ejector pump then suddenly became 60 gallons a minute in and 240 gallons a minute out.
Based on the Venturi system, the ejector pump proved that it could amplify the effectiveness of the above-ground fire pump by a factor of 4.
within a very short time, within sort of, I think, probably 3/4 of an hour or an hour, we emptied the sump, and that was really what we were looking for. So in the event of a rescue in there, we had the provision and the knowledge to be able to pump it out, and that's what really happened.
In the Mendips too, the fire service were often called upon.
It was one of the biggest rescue operations ever mounted in the vast network of caves under the Mendips. 2 separate groups were trapped with their escape route cut off by floodwater. Rescuers went down repeatedly to try to find a way through. In a desperate effort to lower the water level, firemen began pumping 600 gallons of water a minute out of the caverns and into a neighbouring system.
We're rather concerned. We're just waiting for the first contact to be established with the trapped party, and that is always a worrying moment, of course.
All right. There's somebody just beyond the first sump. They don't know which party it is, and they don't know how they are, but they have made contact. Over.
And in less than an hour, the first of them reached the surface. All were experienced cavers, one party from London University, the other a group of scouts from Essex. Those trapped included 3 women. Fortunately, no one had been injured.
They were in considerable danger had, in fact, the rain continued as much as we'd had earlier on today, and if we hadn't have got the services of the fire service here with their pumps, because they really did make the difference.
They were trapped by floodwater, and one of them, 20-year-old Thurza Holden, was struck by a heavy boulder.
On the way back out, we started to hit quite high floodwater, which made our pitch impassable. So we decided to sit it out in a high rift full of boulders. We perched up in these boulders and moved about to observe the water level from time to time. And it was during this moving about that the boulder was dislodged and come down and crushed onto Thurza.
Odds weren't very high in her favour of coming out of there too well. A rock had tumbled on her and fractured her pelvis. Luckily, we'd had an exercise on Burke's Fell, and I had worked out where water could be diverted from and to dry up parts of the cave. And when it came to the realities of this, for this particular incident, the success of those earlier practices were so great that we virtually dried the cave up, which improved her chances of getting out tremendously. And she came out, and she's in pretty good spirits now. I saw her not so long ago. That was another big success as far as I was concerned.
If you get into any difficulties,
Caves had also become seen as a good adventure activity for youngsters, often calling on the services of the rescue teams when things went wrong. In 1982, a group of scouts headed into Dido's cave near Matlock Bath. But even a seemingly straightforward cave can hold hidden hazards.
Get yourself dry quickly. Before we do anything else, can we just check how many we've got? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8,
Where's
9.
Phil? I've got his torch.
Who? Phil Gregory?
Yeah.
You sure he's not here?
No.
What had happened was that when Philip ducked under the sump, he'd gone too deep and went 20 feet along an underwater passage that nobody knew was there.
Came up, banged my head, and there was no air. It was completely confusing. I had no idea where I was. I was expecting to see all these people, and there was no light. It was completely pitch black, so black you can't describe.
In spite of a thorough search, Derbyshire Cave Rescue couldn't find any sign of Philip.
So if he's in there, he's underwater.
It was 3 o'clock in the morning when Alan and his 2 divers, Chris and Jeff, began their underwater search.
I literally fell through a slot, sort of letterbox-shaped hole, into a passage which was full of water.
So because I was breathing so heavily, I started floating up.
I have an image of a light coming out of the water. That was one of the most sort of reassuring and wonderful sights. I can't describe it to you in words, really.
His lips were purple. His breathing was just desperate, absolutely desperate. And I thought he had minutes to live, minutes to live.
It was Gaping Gill's stream passage pod where Jeremy Peterson was to cause the biggest cave rescue operation of modern times.
Jeremy was a solo caver, this particular instance, and had abseiled through stream passage pot with the intention of exiting through a pre-rigged bar pot.
Following an entrance rope descent of 25 feet, he needed to descend 85 feet and 95 foot drops, pulling the rope down behind him. All seems to have gone to plan until he reached the final 75 foot pitch.
When he got to the final pitch, it would appear that what happened was his rope, his double rope pull-through rope, had jammed. He was unable to free it. Eventually it didn't turn up, and so CRO were called initially and did what we would call the trade routes. We looked down through all the passages in the near passages adjacent to where he was likely to have been and couldn't find him. The whole situation then changed somewhat, and we had, because of manpower and timescales and exhaustion and so on, to call other teams.
But could it be he had already got out and was lost somewhere on the surface? It was becoming a huge operation.
Eventually, we finished up after almost 50 hours and more with a list of about 4 or 5 possibilities that we were unsure about, which we didn't have enough, how can I say, feedback from the rescue teams to be absolutely sure that they'd searched them properly. And you then start to ask yourself, well, if we can't find them and we've done the thinkable things, they must have done something pretty stupid.
Mud Pot had supposedly been checked earlier.
It was my idea to make damn certain that someone did go down the pitch in Mud Pot, which was where he was actually found. Other people reckoned that they'd been there, and it became apparent to me that they hadn't.
So eventually, sometime in the late evening of Monday evening, this is now, they finished up shouting, climbing down and shouting, and climbing down and shouting, and lo and behold, they received a reply, and it was a thankful Jeremy Peterson.
The route of our pod goes past Mud Pot to follow stream passage towards Gaping Gill. Somehow, Jeremy Peterson decided that he still had to descend another pitch and followed the stream down Mud Pot. In the process, he had taken a fall